the Hudson Library and Historical Society's Storytellers series presents local history storyteller Katherine Kohl, speaking about the Rockefellers, the Cleveland Connection. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on September 16, 2014.
I'm pleased to introduce storyteller Katherine Kohl. She's a history storyteller and retired corporate secretary of the Lakeview Cemetery Association and director of development of the Lakeview Cemetery Foundation. Some of you I know are big fans of hers. In fact, we were getting sign-ups before we even publicized it, so I think she has some followers in the area. So she's pretty well known. She addresses 50 to 60 audiences in Ohio every year on the topic of history alive in the Western Reserve. So she does a variety of programs. And she continues to be a speaker and consultant for historic cemeteries across the country. She was also the first woman elected an official of the Lakeview Cemetery, and she's proud of it. Without further ado, Katherine Kohl.
Lakeview Cemetery. All of my history is based on Lakeview Cemetery to begin with. Now it's not. I'm out on my own and I'm able to go further than just Lakeview Cemetery. How many people are familiar with Lakeview? Great. And you know what a wonderful, it's a wonderful place for history. It's a wonderful place to go for beauty and so forth and so on. And it just has all the things there. I came into Lakeview Cemetery only on a whim. I was not going to take the job. I just went in there to interview because I thought I better do something full-time. My children are all in school and college, and I said, I have to do this. And I didn't know very much about Lakeview Cemetery or Cleveland, Ohio, for that matter, when I moved here. I came from Erie, Pennsylvania, by way of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So I knew a lot about Canadian and, of course, British history, but I didn't know much about here. And did I start to learn when I came into Lakeview? And I started just as a secretary and then went on to be corporate secretary. And then when the foundation came in, I went into that as a corporate secretary and director of development, which meant I had to develop different kinds of programs in the cemetery. Well, history, right? And that's where the whole thing started. And that's where I really did learn a lot because I had been accumulating all of this information as I went through. So Lakeview Cemetery is where this whole thing all began. And of course, one of the big names, of course, that I ran into when I first got there was Mr. Rockefeller, and I knew that name and everybody else does too. So I went on to do that, and then I retired after 20 years at Lakeview Cemetery on a job that I wasn't going to take. And then I went on after that to do these programs on my own, and I started with all the programs and built up all of the criteria that I have, and I have some wonderful topics. And you see me sitting here because I'm a storyteller. I don't tell history from a very serious standpoint. It's all true that I'm telling you. It's everything that you might not know, because you sort of, in some cases, have to read between the lines a little bit. And so this is what I went on to do. And this is one of my very favorite ones. Of course, if you ask me which is my favorite one, I will say the one I'm giving tonight, because it's just that way. Whenever I'm giving one speech, I like that one best, and if I'm giving another one, then I like that one best. So it's a lot of fun to do this, and I'm just having a great time doing it. And so let's move on to what we're here because. We're here because of the Rockefeller family. And Eliza Davison is this wonderfully happy-looking woman that you're looking at. And you have to remember when they had their photographs taken in those days, they couldn't move an inch. So they were just posed like this, and that's how it had to look. And most of them looked pretty grim in their photographs, including she looked very serious. She was a descendant of Puritans, actually, born in 1813. And she had no formal education at all. In fact, this woman could not read or write until she was well into adulthood, well into it. You have to remember that. That's a very important point to make. She had all of her education, if you will, took place in the church. She was a devout Baptist. She learned it all from the Bible. If she learned a word here or there, she learned that from the Bible. And church was her whole idea of life. This is all formed around that. She was born in New York State. Her father and mother were pretty middle-class people. They weren't poor. They had a nice middle-class life. And she was born in 1813 and 1836. She was living at home with her parents. She was age 23. And there was a knock on her front door. And she went to the front door to open it, and there stood, and I'm going to quote this, a tall, broad-shouldered, brown-eyed, storytelling, card-playing stranger. His name was William Big Bill Rockefeller. Oh my, he was different than she was. He was a gambler. He clouted in himself as a door-to-door medicine salesman. Does anybody in the room remember Lydia Pinkham's Pink Pills for Pale People? Yes, that's the kind of thing that he sold door to door. He was a wanderer. He was a horse thief. He was married to more than one woman at a time, and so forth. He was a very interesting person. He had a wonderful attitude about life. He was a salesman, and he sold himself as a wonderful person, which he really was. Well, he knocked on this door, and here's this lovely, shy young woman answering the door. And of course, at age 23, she was an old maid. Yes, she was. That was her title. And so he wooed her quite nicely. He was probably knocked over with the attention she was getting from him. Her parents didn't like the idea that she was falling in love with this person, but he sold himself to her as a nice person, which his personality was. He got through to her. They were married, and it must have been quite a very interesting life that she had, because she was home, he was gone. He was a gambler. He was out gambling. He was out doing his thing and selling medicine door to door and so forth. He would leave her and then come home after a month or so, or she never knew when he was going to come back home. And he would come home with a lot of money, so there was no problem there. And so when he'd come home, he'd play, after they had children. By the way, she had all of the children that she had on homeopathic medicine, which they did in those days. And she had a girl first, and then she had a boy next. And Mr. Rockefeller and she were married by that time. And when he'd come home, he'd give her the money, and she had to do with it what she wanted. And they bought a small home there in New York State, so it was pretty nice. And all of a sudden, she had the children, and he'd come home, he'd ride piggyback with them. Let me show you a picture of the two of them. I think this is a really nice picture. He's a nice-looking man. Very nice-looking man. She's, at that point, a little older and a little happier. And they were called Eliza, and Big Bill was his nickname. They had been asked, all of a sudden, they were asked to leave town. Big Bill got himself into a bit of a scrape. And so they were asked to leave the town that they were living in. So she had to leave her parents and so forth and move out. And this is how they eventually arrived in the Cleveland area, is because they had to move on. They moved on to one place was Parma, another place was Hudson, staying with Big Bill's relatives at that time, right here. Eventually into Strongsville, and Strongsville is where they made their home then. Big Bill's sister was living in Strongsville. So they came into Strongsville, and there they stayed. By that time, Dad was sort of gone and not back all the time. But when he'd come back and he'd give them the money, I told you their second child was a boy, and his name was John Davison Rockefeller. And we all know what he grew up to be. He was America's first millionaire, America's first billionaire. He really had a lot of good sense in money, especially. And because his mom had to handle this money, she knew how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. But she didn't know how to read and write. So she and her firstborn boy handled all the money. In those days, girls couldn't do it anyway. Even if we wanted to handle it, we couldn't do it. So the firstborn son, was the one that cooperated with her and learned how to do all of this. So they worked together. And because he ended up then handling money all of his life very wonderfully, who taught him? His mother, right? So she is really the one behind the brains of this man who went on to serve the whole country in millions of ways, I swear. Well, maybe not millions, but at least thousands anyway. Because as I went on through doing all of the development of this speech, I had to go back in and look through all kinds of reference books, and I ran into really interesting things about John D. and his money and how he handled it and what he did with it and so forth. And you're going to hear more about that as we go along. By the time, and I'm talking about when the children were high school age. In fact, John D. Rockefeller went to school at Central High School. Anybody know where that was? Over in Cleveland. They were living, of course, in Strongsville. Strongsville was a long way away from Central High School. So he had to board to come up there, and he did. He went all the way through school, except all the way to the end of his senior year in high school, when Dad was gone by that time. So he had to leave school and support his mother full time. So that's the education that he got. He did follow it up in later years with a business college. He went there to learn what he was trying to do and learning the proper way to do it and so forth. So he did get that. But he did not have a graduation degree from high school. So we have Eliza also living on money from her dad's estate. So there was money coming in there too. So they didn't have such a bad time, even though Big Bill was gone. And they have, let's go to the next picture here. And we can see John D. Rockefeller at the age of 20 with his brothers and sisters. Now this is 1859. Left to right is John. Then Lucy. Lucy was the firstborn. She was the girl that came first. Then Mary, who was the last of the children. And then Frank and William. Frank and William were his brothers that he was very close to both of them. One problem with Frank was that he was very much like his dad and didn't like John D. because John D. was getting a lot of attention and so forth. And he just resented a little bit that he was doing so well. And he, in later years, as a matter of fact, he was supported by John D., but John D. could never tell him that he was supporting him. He was giving him money under the table, so to speak, because he wouldn't have taken it if he had known his brother was giving him the money. But this is how it was in the household. He gave the money to him. He was living on that, but never knew what his brother had done. And William, of course, is the one that went with him right through Standard Oil and did all of the good things. He's the one that ran the railroads down in the East, and after they moved to New York State and so forth, he was very, very active in it, and he was a very, very big friend of William. But Franklin was his name, and Frank was his nickname, and he was not on good terms with John Dee. In fact, to the point where, if you're familiar with Lakeview Cemetery, you know where the monument is, the Rockefeller monument up on top of the hill. It's a large obelisk. And down in the same section where the obelisk stands is another headstone. In fact, it's a memorial. It's a large headstone. And it is Franklin's headstone. And when he had it put into place, here's the obelisk here. Here's his monument. He had it moved to face this way. The only monument in that area that's faced at an odd angle, and that's because he didn't want it facing John Dee's monument. That was how deep this was for him. So anyway, they were in Strongsville. They had a good life. They had, in fact, any teachers in this room, or ex-teachers, you would be very pleased to hear their classroom in Central High School. It was John Dee, of course, Marcus Hanna, Charles F. Brush, and the woman that was to be the young girl who was to be his wife in later years, all in this one classroom. That's a lot of brains in there. I think it would have been really nice for the teachers to be able to go through school with this kind of a bunch of young people in their classroom. And this is a young girl that he met in school. Her name is Laura Celestia, or she was called Seti, Spellman. She was born in 1839, just about the same age as John Dee. And her parents were Lucy and Henry Spellman. She came from down south a little bit, Akron, Canton area. So we're covering that part of the Western Reserve with her. They were Congregationalists, and they were abolitionists. Those two items of news you need to remember because it's very important. It is to become important as we go along. Met John at Central High School, and she graduated from school. And I always thought it was so interesting where she taught school. She couldn't find a job here in Cleveland, so she taught school. This is 1850. And she taught school in Massachusetts, actually at a Quaker school, and then she was out west and teaching out west. And I thought in 1850, this is very interesting. Did you know that women went that far to teach? I was very pleased to hear that. And of course then in 1859 moved back into Cleveland and taught school here in Cleveland. Her parents and Laura's kept on with the Underground Railroad. Their house was on the Underground Railroad down in Canton area. And they kept on with that. John Dee then became very infatuated with her. He visited her home. Also, he was engaged then finally to Laura. And in 1864, they had a wedding. And at the wedding, he was very devout Baptist. She was a Congregationalist. Two ministers that married them. Neither one had given up the ship. They had a Congregationalist minister and a Baptist minister there. But listen to where they honeymooned. I thought this was very interesting. They honeymooned in Niagara Falls, Montreal, Quebec, Boston, New York City, Niagara Falls, and then home. Now, that is 1864. That's a pretty good honeymoon as far as I'm concerned. And of course, he was already into doing some work. He started in the grain business and so forth. And then of course they had children. They had 5 children, and we'll look into that a little bit now. And you can see there, and don't you love that picture of John D. with the mustache and with hair on top of his head. He had a bit of a problem in later years with that. The reason why you see him walking the streets in New York City, very often you see the picture of him with a top hat on, and it was because he had alopecia in later years. So he was covering that up. And just to show his sense of humor was funny. And you don't find it written very many places, but I really got a kick out of reading the fact that he used to have, when he had no hair on his head, he had a set of wigs that he wore, all different colors. And he said he loved to walk down the streets of New York City and find the people greeting him, "Hello, Mr. Rockefeller," and then they'd look at him and, "Well, there's something different about this man. What is it?" Well, it was the fact that he had a different color wig on his head that they weren't aware of, and he just laughed. He laughed inside. He thought that was great fun to set them out and try to figure out what he was doing. So and there he even has a mustache, which I hope is not a fake one. I don't think it was. And those are his children that they had. The children also were born in homeopathic medicine and so forth. And by the time the children were being born, he was already in business, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But look at the little boy that's there. John Jr. was his name, and he was the last of the children to be born. And Mr. Rockefeller was just upset. You couldn't have a girl to take over your business. Women were not allowed to do anything like that in those days. In fact, we weren't allowed to even have money. If we married somebody, that the husband owned us and owned the money that we brought into the family. So he was distressed at this. What am I going to do? I have no sons. And finally, he had this child that was born that was male. And he had an office down in Cleveland, beautiful office that he had there. And he had it set up pretty much like this room is set up here. There was an aisleway right down the center. His desk was up in front. And all of these people sitting like you're sitting had a desk in front of them. And that was his office. And when that child was born, Mr. Rockefeller came in, and instead of handing out cigars like a lot of men do, he came in the back door there, and he shouted, and he turned cartwheels all the way down the aisle until he got to the front. He was ecstatic. He thought it was so great that he had this son now, and the son really was just pampered and set up completely to take over the business. He was not quite the same type of a person as his dad. He was more like his mother, and he had a hard time doing what he was expected to do. So eventually what he did to all of we all have to be proud of this, everyone in this room. He went into the philanthropy end of it. And Mr. Rockefeller set him up as head of the foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. So this is where he started, and this is where he went into and did a wonderful job with it. And he was very happy with that. In philanthropy, it's different than earning the bread and butter and earning the big bucks. He was doing a lot of spending of the big bucks. And this made him happy, and he was happy in that. But that's going on further. So they had the children. They had their honeymoon. They're all set, and this is John D. as a young man, looking very lovely. Now, the young couple. In the meantime, let's go to the next one and look at that. The two of them, very nice-looking people. John D. had his first job right out of high school. Hewlett and, what was the other name? It was a grain business that he got into. And he got vegetables and so forth and so forth. But he got into that right out of high school, and he did very well at that. What he did when he got into this, his first paycheck, well, he didn't have a paycheck, he probably had a bag with money in it, but the first payment that he got for a job, 10% of that went into charity. 10%. 10% of every penny he earned went into charity for the rest of his life. When he went into Standard Oil, when he went into all of the other phases of things that he did, 10% of that money went into Ledger A. He started with Ledger A. Ledger A had the first, well, let me quickly look and see if I can find the page, and we'll go through that right now before we go any further. The page is called Charitable Giving. And his first paycheck, or his first money that he earned, in 1856, $19.31 went into Ledger A. And then it continued all the way through. In 1887, he had contributed $250,000. That was when Standard Oil was being incorporated, etc. 1892, $1.3 million. And that was after the trust was broken. Do you remember the trust that had to be broken, and Standard Oil broke up and went into Esso, went up to Canada and Mobil Oil, and up until a few years ago, almost everything that we bought was derived from Standard Oil. Not so much anymore. Now we have, of course, now we have Standard Oil isn't even here. It's England. So anyway, we have that. In 1913, the Rockefeller Foundation was founded, and that went in, and you know that some beautiful places in the United States are all Rockefeller. You don't find his name on it, though. If you go down into, what's the place in Maryland or Virginia? Williamsburg, Virginia. That's my husband. He cues me when I forget. Williamsburg, did you know, I mean, a lot of people don't even realize that is Rockefeller. And when I was down there, we were visiting down there, I walked up, we were walking along the road, and I looked up at a door that was over here, and it had a nice glass window in it, and on that window was written the Rockefeller Foundation. That's the only place you find any reference to Rockefeller. Never, never, never did he want his name advertised. There's tons of things that he had never brought to anybody's attention, including here in Cleveland area also, and we'll talk about that in a minute after we get through with this. John Jr. came in, founded the University of Chicago, and you know that at one point he wanted to fund Western Reserve, his hospital at Western Reserve University here in Cleveland, and they said no, they didn't want his money, so he said okay, and he took it up to Chicago, and that's where they got their big planetarium and everything up at the University of Chicago. Kind of a shame that we didn't get it, but that's how it was. By the way, did you all know that the Western Reserve University and University Hospital is the first private hospital to join the university, the teaching and the hospital in the country? I thought that was very interesting. That's an offshoot. That doesn't have to do with Mr. Rockefeller. By 1955, $2 billion had been contributed to philanthropy. That's a lot of money. Even that $19.31 was more than what we would know. I don't know what it would transfer to today, but a whole lot more than 1931. In Cleveland, more than $865,000 in land for parks. Did you know that the Shaker Lakes that was his property? How about the One World Day that just took place the other day? And if you were down to it, you would have seen a whole lot of fun down there. That's a great place to go on One World Day, because you have all of the cultural gardens going up on East Boulevard and down on Martin Luther King Drive. And that piece of land, Mr. Gordon gave the part by the lake. Mr. Wade, Jephthah Wade, who was the man who put together Western Union Telegraph Company, gave all the land up in the University Circle area where the museums are. All of the land between Mr. Wade's and Mr. Gordon's was Rockefeller, and he gave that to the city of Cleveland. So the cultural gardens, Martin Luther King Drive, and of course that used to be called Liberty Boulevard there, down in the bottom, and the west and the East Boulevard up on top, all Rockefeller land. Okay, now we have something else kind of interesting. We'll park this one in the meantime, come back to it a little bit later. But let's look at the next picture. Kind of a fun picture also. Their homes. The home on the top is on Millionaires Row. You all know what Millionaires Row is? Is there anyone in the room that doesn't know what it is? Okay, then we know that Rockefellers had a home on there. It was on the corner. It was a very nice home. It was in 1868 they purchased it. It had belonged to somebody else before the Rockefellers had it. But they were very happy in it, except that Laura said they lived on the wrong side of Millionaires Row. Now, how do you live on the wrong side of Millionaires Row? I really couldn't figure out for a while until I finally found it written down. The reason why she called it the wrong side is because on Millionaires Row on Euclid Avenue, on one side of the road, the houses had a real long front yard, and they also had a view of the lake. On the other side, they had a very, very short front yard, and of course they had to go to their back door to see the lake. So therefore, it was the wrong side of Millionaires Row because it had the short front yard. But they were very happy down there. They loved it. And then they decided the house on the bottom is very, very unique. In 1874, of course, they wanted to build a country home. He wanted something that had big porches where they could go out and they could sit and they could have the good air coming into them, get out of the city proper. The city of Cleveland at that point came to East 55th Street. So they were way out beyond Lakeview Cemetery, which is about 10 or maybe more than that blocks from East 55th Street. And it's 12316 Euclid Avenue is the address of Lakeview, so it had to be a little further out than that. So it's 123 streets out, give or take. So it was in Forest Hill, what they called Forest Hill. And he had this wonderful, wonderful place built. And he wanted it as a spa kind of a place so that they could have all this fresh air and sunshine. And it was in East Cleveland. And when you think of East Cleveland now, you think of it very differently than out in the fresh air. But of course, Cleveland wasn't out that far yet. It was only at 55th Street, so it was really out but people smile when you say that because it's quite different. It was 49 or 79 acres when he bought it. And he actually built a little railroad to get out to it also, so that you could come out and you could visit out there, and you didn't have to even drive your car once it came to be, or take your horses out there or whatever. And so they had this house. He decided and a little tiny golf course, small golf course in the front. He loved golf. In fact, he wanted Laura to learn how to play golf, and she was afraid to have him teach her. She didn't want him to teach her. So she hired somebody to come in and teach her how to play golf. And so he asked her one day, "We'll come out and we'll play some golf out and on the front lawn." And she did, and she was pretty good. And she was hitting the ball, and Rockefeller was just astounded. And she had to then confess that she had gotten some help, a little bit of help, but she wanted to surprise him on what she had done. And then he invited some friends to come over for the weekend, probably, for a few days anyway. And he invited them to come out, and they had a wonderful time. There were one couple that came out and their family. And they played a little golf. They sat out on the porches. They had a wonderful time. And they were getting ready to go back home at the end of this, and he presented them with an invoice. Yes. And they said, "We didn't know you were going to charge us for this." And they raised a little bit of a fuss about it. And he just looked blank. He had never even thought that they would object to coming. And he said, no, you're right. I should not have charged you to stay at my house. And he never charged anybody again. They didn't have to pay him, and nobody else had to after that. But that was just the way his mind worked. He made money. He was forced into this as a young man, and he made money wherever he could, but he never charged another person. So the story goes anyway about staying with him in that house. But it was a lovely home. Another home that they had after that, of course, was in New York City when they moved into New York City, and that was, and this home that you look at, the lovely home on the bottom there, had a fire in 1917, and it was burned to the ground, and so there's nothing left of it at all, which is so sad. In fact, there's nothing left except a couple houses still going on Millionaire's Row on the top one. And he had a partner by the name of Samuel Andrews, Mr. Rockefeller did, and Andrews had a home on Millionaire's Row that was very large. It had something like 80 rooms in it, and very, very big. It was always called Andrews Folly because it was so large. And he, when he died, he said, no one but an Andrews could live in that house. Mr. Andrews himself had trouble heating it and so forth. It was so big, and his son took it over upon his death, and he couldn't run the house either. So because of what was written in his will, it was razed. In 1923, it was razed all the way down to the ground, and we lost all of those homes except for just a couple in that like manner. I always said, an 80-room house, we would have known now what to do with that. Would that not have made a wonderful bed and breakfast? Yeah, I think so. But in any case, those are the houses that they had. And of course, in later years, he spent time in Ormond, Florida, too, where he was living. And this was after he was all the way out. He had something like 23 years to live after he was out of Standard Oil, and he planned his retirement like he planned his life. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he did it in retirement. Pretty neat guy. This is, going on to the next one, just a little sort of, I saw this because I thought it was really kind of neat. This is when all the men were going out to Colorado and out to the west, and they had copper mines out there and mining, and they were heavily invested in them, so they were going out there. And this is one of the trips that they took out there with the family. And they have the family sitting there. Bessie, Laura's sister, is over clear to the right there. And Aunt Lucy, and then Lucy Spellman, who has little John Jr. with her. And Alta and Edith are the two little girls sitting in the front. And this was taken out in Colorado in 1875, kind of a nice little family get-together there. And those two little girls are going to fit into something that's kind of interesting. The other people are Robert Hopkins, which I'm not positive who they are, and then Charles Norris is the other person that's in there. And of course, this is a good look now on the children. This is John Jr. as he's grown up a little bit. Elizabeth or Bessie. Alice, they had a little girl by the name of Alice who died as an infant, so you'll not see a picture of her. But then Alta, who married a Prentice, and Edith, who married a McCormick, and then John D. Jr. there, who married Abby Aldrich and Martha B. Allen. Okay, now we have to look at this next little adventure. This is a school down in the South. Just before the turn of the century, it was built. And it was the first place of higher learning for black girls or women down in the South. And it was built to look just exactly like this picture. This comes from the archives of the college itself. And they had a very nice little campus. They wanted to do something better with it. They wanted to maybe build brick buildings instead of just wooden and so forth. So the women who represented that school came up to Cleveland. It was a Baptist school. They knew Mr. Rockefeller was here. Mr. Rockefeller was approached at the Baptist church. They came to the Baptist church and they said, Mr. Rockefeller, could you support this college? Mr. Rockefeller said, yes, I will. And he gave them $100,000. This is before the turn of the century. That was quite a bit of money in those days. And he gave it to them, and they wanted to name this Rockefeller College. He said, no, this is now when he is not letting people talk about him. He didn't want his name in the paper. No, you're not going to name it after me. However, my wife's family were abolitionists. Their house was on the Underground Railroad. Let's name the college after that. Spelman College in Georgia. Still a wonderful campus. My husband and I happened to be driving down in Georgia. My sister lives up in the foothills of the Blue Ridge, and we were driving down through Georgia. And I was riding co-pilot, so I was looking at maps. And I all of a sudden said to my husband, get off at the exit. Why? He said. I said, because I have found Spelman College on the map, and we're going to go right past it. He said, how far is it? I said, it's only this far. So he's pretty used to me doing things like that, and he pulled right off. We got right off. Well, we had so big an adventure that day. We drove into the college. They stopped us at the gates. And of course, I hadn't written ahead. If I had known we were going to do this, I would have written ahead. But I hadn't done anything, and I explained what I was doing. I said, he's going in. I want this for my speech that I have on Mr. Rockefeller. And so they said, okay, you can go ahead, you can go in. And they introduced me to, and you know the place they took me? To one building that was called Rockefeller Hall. So they had one building in there with an inscription on the top done in the piece of granite that went across the doorway that you could almost see it until you got right up on top of it. But this is what it looked like after the money went in. This is 1900. This is right at the turn of the century. This is after the Rockefeller money went into it. And I must say it's before a lot of landscaping went into it too. It looks much nicer than that because we took pictures of it. And that's what it looks like today. It's a beautiful college. And I have run into people. In fact, I even had someone in my audience one day who had gone to Spelman College and didn't realize the input from Mr. Rockefeller. Most people don't. So, and this would make him very happy, because he didn't want anyone to know about it anyway. So that's what it looks like today, and and the co-ed that took us around the campus and showed us everything was a very delightful person. And so you can rest assured that Mr. Rockefeller's college, even though it's not Rockefeller, is really a very, very fine school. And another thing that he did, how about Alta House? Anybody here ever been to Alta House or know where it is down in Little Italy? It's a wonderful. Do you know why it's called Alta House? That's his daughter. That's Alta, his daughter. And the Rockefeller women came into Alta House after they built it. It's a settlement house. And they came into it and they worked with the Italian women who were coming over. Little Italy is where it is because Lakeview Cemetery is where it is. All of the artisans that came in for working on stone and so forth, and we have a quarry actually at Lakeview Cemetery too. So they all came in to work there. And so the women, the Rockefeller women, would go in and they'd teach them how to read English and how to shop. They'd take them shopping and they'd let them know how to translate everything into Italian and so forth, what they were doing. So that's the, and oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you another little thing about Spelman College. When they were taking us on the tour around, we went into a chapel. They said, oh, you must come into the chapel. And they didn't say very much about it. I think they were waiting for us to react to it. So they took us into the chapel, and I looked at the inscription above the door, and it was Sisters Chapel. And I thought, Sisters Chapel, that's interesting. I'd never been to a chapel that had Sisters Chapel on it. And we walked in, and I soon found out what sisters meant. The two Spelman sisters, the two women, were on the wall right as you go in. So that was another Rockefeller gift for the Spelman people, not just ordinary, but the chapel, which made it that way. And of course, this one is another one a lot of people don't know. They just know it's a wonderful place for people to go in Little Italy, and they have a wonderful bocce court in the front of it that you can play and so forth, but that is also. Now in 1911, the Standard Oil was dissolved. After it was dissolved, he planned to enjoy his retirement as he went on. He thought that it was really kind of neat to be able to do that, and we have himself enjoying his late retirement. In 1916, he was declared America's first billionaire. So we have that going for him. Now we're going to turn the page and we're going to come to some more really interesting. Oh, here's Mr. Rockefeller in his top hat. We don't know what color his hair is that day because it's covered. And of course, that's John Jr. walking next to him. And then we go on to the next one. That's in New York City, by the way. And at this point, we have to enter into a bit of yellow journalism that came along. It's kind of hard to know how to explain what happened with this young woman who picked on Mr. Rockefeller all his life. When he went into Titusville, Pennsylvania, this is where, remember the Drake oil well when it was struck in Titusville, Pennsylvania? That changed the complexion of all of this area of Ohio and Pennsylvania. There was Oil City in Pennsylvania. There was all kinds of different names directly leading to the oil that had been struck there in the oil well. And Mr. Rockefeller was in the grain business to begin with, but when this was struck, he thought, there's something here. This is going to be big. He felt it, and he thought he wanted to get into it. So he left there, and he took with him all but one of his partners. In the grain business, he was with one partner, and this man stayed with the grain business, and he didn't come in with him. But all of the other ones came into the Standard Oil, into the oil business with them, the refinery business. And they built up the refineries all through the area here. And he really ran a closed shop. He had a lot of brains, and he had good people. Mr. Andrews, the one that had Andrews Follies, he was his lab person. He was the one that decided how to, they were refining this crude oil into whatever the other products were. And he had a corner on the market, shall we say, because of what he was doing. He grew that business to an enormous amount. He had, his brother, of course, was running the railroads finally. They used to have to ship it down the canal, down to the Ohio River, and to get it out there. They could take it out on the Great Lakes, and they could ship it out in the Great Lakes, but they could only go in one direction. Well, as far as Erie, Pennsylvania, and I suppose it would be Buffalo too, but then it couldn't go any further. And the transportation, you couldn't go down the St. Lawrence Seaway. The St. Lawrence Seaway wasn't there. It was just the St. Lawrence River. And you couldn't get over Niagara Falls, and you couldn't get around it because there was nothing there to get around it. So they were locked in. And this is one reason why they headed out then eventually to New York City, because they could then transport it across the ocean, and they could do some transportation that way. And of course, the people who joined him were wonderfully. They had one man who ran all of the railroads down the East Coast. If you go down to what's at the bottom, Key West, down in Florida, and you'll find Mr. Flagler. Thank you. Mr. Flagler. And has anyone seen it? Has anyone been down to Key West? The Flagler Museum's down there too. Yeah, you go into that. It's a good surprise when you get down there. And he did all of that. In fact, if you're driving down Key West and you're going down the road south, you can look over and you can see the stanchions over here. And those big stanchions that don't have anything on top of them now are where the railroads went down. They were all above water, of course. That's what Florida was all about, was water down there in those days. So they had that, and they took them all the way down there. And Mr. Flagler was in charge of that. In fact, Mr. Flagler's the only one really big person in the group that joined that isn't buried at Lakeview Cemetery. He's buried down in St. Augustine, down in Florida. So we have that, and we have all the things that went on. Yellow journalism that he had, Miss Ida Tarbell. Everybody know that name? That's another one that you learn from a history book here and there, because he picked on Mr. Rockefeller all the way along. She was about 15 years younger than Mr. Rockefeller. But her dad was a barrel maker in Titusville, Pennsylvania. He was the one who built the barrels for Mr. Rockefeller to ship his oil in. And he had they were small, and he had a small business, but he built it up really big. And all of a sudden, he was too small for Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller needed bigger barrels. And Mr. Tarbell could not get the bigger barrels because he didn't have a big enough business. So Mr. Rockefeller gave them to another company that could do it. And he also had purchased a lot of refineries in this area, so he has a big business going with them. And by the way, he did try to buy up, and he did buy up a lot of the refineries that were small. One time there were something like 15 to 20 or maybe even more refineries in this area. They all got into it at one time. And so they had a great big business going here. And he said, I want these big barrels, and we're going to have to use them. And by the way, he did buy those refineries when he took them over. He gave them a fair price, and they were very disappointed after he purchased them, because they thought, now my business is gone, forgetting to tell the people that he had paid a good price for it. In fact, what he did when he purchased them, he offered them money or Standard Oil stock. And guess which one they took? Almost all of them took the money. Right. You think what would have happened if they had have taken the stock? Wow. So in any case, we have Ida Tarbell now, who is this young woman who is the daughter of Mr. Tarbell, the barrel maker. And now her dad's business has been taken from him. And she said he was never the same after this happened. And he lost his will to do something. He lost his will to keep the factory going, so to speak. And so Ida Tarbell took off then. She was the first woman to be given a college degree at Allegheny State College, which is in Pennsylvania, just below Erie, Pennsylvania. And she was a journalist. She had a major in journalism, only woman there. She was in the whole class, and she had their respect. Maybe not in the beginning, but they had a lot of respect for her because she was a very good writer. She went by herself over to Paris, wrote over there, did some biographies, and one was of Napoleon, they were very, very good. She was a good writer. But in all of this, she was still out, and as many times as she could get to a newspaper to do something and write something on him, she would deride Mr. Rockefeller. And she kept it up and kept it up. She finally was working for McClure magazine. That's an old magazine, but it was sort of like the magazines today. They had serials as they went along month to month, and they'd have enough. Well, she wrote a whole year's worth of serials on Mr. Rockefeller and that. She came to Cleveland, Ohio, snuck into the Baptist church, sat in the back. Mr. Rockefeller was giving a Sunday school lesson when this happened, asking people in the back about Mr. Rockefeller. She wanted to know, where's his dad? The one thing she wanted to get to him on was his dad, who was secreted by that time over in Indiana. And so she kept it up and kept it up and kept it up, and finally never would come to. He used to call her Mrs. Ida Tarbell, which wasn't very kind. But it's written that he had called her that. But he would never talk to her. He would never let any of his friends, don't talk to that woman, please don't talk to that woman and tell her because she's out to get me. And they didn't. And so she never she never got it. She, of course, he outlived her, even though he lived a great life. And so he went through all of this with her. And I do have a wonderful picture of her here on a book that I put down someplace, and I'll find it if anyone wants to come up here afterwards and just look at her. She's a very, very nice-looking woman. She doesn't look like what I had thought she would look like. My husband wondered what I thought she would look like. I think he thought she'd have little horns on her head or something. But in any case, she was an excellent writer. So now we have all of that to go with. And what did I do with my clicker?
On the floor.
Thank you. Glad you had your eye on that. And there's the Spellman little monument at Lakeview Cemetery, and right across this little sort of a road, tiny small road, is this, and that is the John D. Rockefeller Monument at Lakeview Cemetery. It is fantastic one. You see Rockefeller down at the bottom of it. It stands 72 feet tall, and it is the tallest or biggest piece of granite ever quarried from Barry, Vermont Granite Works for memorialization purposes, and it still holds that record. It's the biggest one for memorialization purposes. And it is one piece of granite. It sits on a small donut way down at the bottom, the square donut down there, and then rises 72 feet up in the air from there. It is just fantastic and a beautiful, beautiful monument. I had a blind group that came out with me one day, and we were going on a walking tour, and I was telling them about all of the things. And when you take blind people, you have to talk a lot, and you have to describe a lot of what they're looking at. So I told them, hold their finger up in the air and run your fingers down that, and that's an obelisk. That's what it looks like. And they wanted to know if it had its name on it, and I said, come on up and you can feel it because it's raised letters on there. And they came up and they ran their hands across the Rockefellers so they could read it with their hands. And they said that was the best thing that they had seen in the whole tour that I did for them at Lakeview Cemetery, was that the fact that they could feel the Rockefeller. And you know that square donut at the bottom? And you know the story about Mr. Rockefeller? He had a little pouch that he carried in his pocket, and he filled it with dimes, and he would give somebody a dime for tying up his horse or opening a door for him or whatever. And he'd take that dime and he'd put it in the palm of their hand, and then he'd close their hand around this, and he'd tell them, now take this and make your fortune. Turn that dime into 2 dimes, tend to take the 2 into 4, and that's what he did on that. So lots of times people come in and they leave dimes down on that ledge that's down there. And I suppose they're trying to make their fortune, find their fortune. And I said, I've tried it, didn't work for me, but you can try it. And so we give it to charity after they do. It doesn't go to the Rockefeller family. It goes to, we've given it to Alta House sometimes too, over there. And then there it is. Okay, so we have now Rockefeller is in the center. Laura is over to the left, and his mother to the right. Where's Dad? Dad isn't there. Dad is in Freeport, Illinois, and he's buried under the name of Dr. William Levinson, and he died in 1906. He's still with another name besides Rockefeller. And up until just recently, I had somebody go up there and find it for me, and they would not tell you at the office of the cemetery where he was. But they found it for me. And so we now know where it is. Not that it's going to do us any good or whatever. But in any case, there is what Mr. Rockefeller's town looks like now. And from Lakeview Cemetery and his obelisk, he's probably looking right down on that right now. And I think that he would think that's a pretty fair. In fact, the Rockefeller building has, does everybody know where that is downtown? And it's gorgeous building. He's got buildings all over the place in all different suburbs. And this is the end of our story about Mr. Rockefeller. Now, anybody have some surprises tonight? Or did you all know everything I told you already? I saw a lot of surprised looks on people's faces, so I think maybe you learned just a little bit. But it's a wonderful story. Does anybody have any questions that you can give me now? Nobody? Yes.
Did he ever, it sounded as if he started that 10% as a tithe, and did he ever make a point of that, or did he preach on that, or did he?
Sure, because that's the Baptist way. The Baptist church believes in tithing, and that's what started the whole thing. So yes, indeed, it was a tithe. Yes. And it was the Erie Street Baptist Church was the name of the church that he belonged to in Cleveland, Ohio.
And he kept it up for his whole life?
His whole life. Yep. With and I would guess the first ones that he did was for the church. But then when it got bigger, it was for everything else that he did. In fact, I had the privilege before I retired from Lakeview Cemetery of reading the board minutes. And I came across something that no one else in that cemetery knew about. In the board minutes was an entry that when they brought that big monument in, it came up the top of the steepest hill in Lakeview Cemetery, and it came up with horses pulling. I mean, this has got to be a heavy weight coming up that hill. And it tore the road up. So the cemetery officers wrote to Mr. Rockefeller, and they said, we'd like you to pay for the damage that the horses did pulling your monument up if you can. So yes, Mr. Rockefeller said, I would be happy to do that. And I don't remember the amount of money they asked for, but you know, this is back turn of the century again, so $500 or something of that nature. So they asked him for that, and he wrote back and he said, no, I will not give you $500 for the horses pulling it up, but I will give you $500 to repair that and $500 more to put in the till, into the general till. So there again, he did the same kind of thing. He paid for the horses pulling this thing up, but he could put, and that was for you and I mean, it went into the general till. It didn't go into his lot. It went into that. And nobody at that office knew about it until I said, look at here, what I found. So now we know the rest of the story. Okay, any others? If you want to come up and look at some of the photographs I have up here, come ahead. And there's books. Oh, by the way, if you want to read more, go get, and they have it in the library, Titan, Titan, by Chernow. He wrote it, and it's a big book like this. Don't be afraid when you look at it, because it reads like a diary. I mean, it really is. You can get through it in less than a week. Yes.
You said Big Bill left by then. Did he leave his family, or did you mean he wasn't served?
No, he left his family when he moved away from here, yes. And he moved up with another family. He has another family up there in that Illinois area. He had another family, too, up in Canada.
What was the significance of, I may have missed this, you may have said that, of putting Levinson in his tomb in Illinois?
Who knows why? He must have liked the name Levinson.
I didn't know we had that option, but okay.
Well, back then, you didn't have to go through the courts to change your name, probably. Because, see, he was in secret up there, and he had another wife. He had a different wife, without benefit of divorce, of course. He left because of business. He left it because he had to get his oil across the ocean. And he couldn't do it from Cleveland. He was bound here. So that's when they moved it down there, and they transported it over there by cars, railroad cars, and they had it going across there, and that's why he ended up. Laura came back here every summer to that home in East Cleveland, every single summer until she died. She died quite a few years before her husband. And that was the reason, the primary reason. Besides, they weren't that nice to him here. You know, I think there was a lot of, there was. And I think it was a lot of envy. Yeah.
My grandfather received one of those diamonds.
Oh, really? Sure. Yes. And he always had the habit of putting it in their hand and saying, this is, he did that. We had a man who dressed up like Rockefeller at this cemetery, and he put one of those dimes in my grandson's hand. He held that for a whole day. They had to pry his hand open to get him to wash his hands.
Thanks to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program and for providing the Storyteller series for the citizens of Hudson. For a DVD or Blu-ray copy of this or any HCTV program, contact Hudson Cable Television at 330-653-2500 or via email at hctv@hudson.oh.us.